Before we begin, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. It helps bring more soothing stories your way. Let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. The gray morning sky hung low over the city as Mary Jenkins pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, the winter chill biting through the fabric. She stood in line at Java Joe's, a small coffee shop that buzzed with the morning rush. Business people with Bluetooth earpieces and tired students clutching laptops filled the space. She tried to ignore the impatient glances from the well-dressed crowd behind her, each tapping a foot or checking their watches as they waited for her to move forward. Ella, her 5-year-old daughter, clung to her side, shifting from foot to foot in her scuffed pink boots. "Mommy, can I have a hot chocolate?" Ella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mary glanced at her wallet, its contents depressingly thin. She gave Ella a tight smile, hoping to mask the tension she felt. "Maybe next time, sweetheart." Ella's face fell, but she didn't argue. Mary's heart ached at the resignation in her daughter's expression, a look no child her age should know so well. As the line inched forward, Mary rehearsed her order in her head. "Just a small coffee. That's all I need." Her stomach growled faintly. She hadn't eaten that morning, choosing instead to save what little money she had for Ella's school lunch later. When it was finally her turn, Mary stepped up to the counter. The barista's expression was neutral, almost bored. "What can I get for you?" "Just a small coffee," Mary said, sliding 2 crumpled dollar bills across the counter. She could feel the people behind her shifting impatiently, sighing as though her presence was an inconvenience. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her focus on the barista. Just as the barista reached for the cup, a deep, gravelly voice spoke from behind her. "Make that 2 and throw in a hot chocolate for the little one." Mary turned, startled. The man who had spoken stood tall despite his hunched posture, his broad shoulders visible beneath a ragged coat. His face was weathered, his dark skin lined with years of hard living, but there was something familiar about him. She couldn't place it immediately, but his presence was commanding, almost magnetic. "Sir, it's fine. I've got it," Mary began, flustered, but the man shook his head. "I insist," he said, his voice firm yet kind. The barista hesitated, her eyes darting between Mary and the man before ringing up the order. As the man dug into his pocket, Mary caught a glimpse of the small collection of coins in his hand. She felt a pang of guilt. He clearly didn't have much more than she did. "You don't have to," she started again, but he interrupted her with a wave of his hand. "You look like you could use a break," he said simply. It was then that recognition hit her like a jolt. Those piercing eyes, that unmistakable tattoo on his face. Her jaw dropped slightly. "Wait, are you Mike Tyson?" she blurted. He chuckled softly, a sound that was both self-deprecating and amused. "Yeah, that's me," he said, sliding the coins across the counter. "At least, I was." Mary was stunned into silence. She had never been much of a boxing fan, but she knew who Mike Tyson was. Everyone did. The man who once dominated the sport, who had lived a life of fame and fortune, was now standing before her, clearly down on his luck. The barista handed over the drinks, and Mike motioned toward an empty table in the corner. "Let's sit," he said, his tone gentle but insistent. Mary hesitated, glancing at Ella, who was now beaming as she clutched the warm cup of hot chocolate. Finally, she nodded. "Thank you," she said, her voice low but earnest. As they sat down, Mary couldn't help but feel a mix of curiosity and discomfort. How had a man like Mike Tyson, once a household name, ended up here, buying coffee for strangers with what little he had? Ella climbed into her lap, sipping happily on her hot chocolate, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Mary looked across the table at Mike, who was stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. "Why did you do that?" she asked, her voice tentative. He looked up, his eyes soft but unwavering. "Because sometimes when you've been where I've been, you know what it's like to need a hand, and when you can give one, you do." Mary didn't know how to respond, so she simply nodded. For the first time in weeks, the weight on her chest felt a little lighter. The small table in the corner of the coffee shop was tucked away from the bustling crowd, offering a semblance of privacy amidst the clatter of cups and low hum of conversations. Mary slid into the chair, balancing Ella on her lap. Across from her, Mike Tyson sat down with the practiced ease of a man used to public scrutiny, even if his circumstances had drastically changed. Ella sipped her hot chocolate with the unguarded delight only a child could muster. Her little fingers curled tightly around the paper cup. "This is yummy," she exclaimed, a smile lighting up her face. Mike grinned, his lips curling upward in a way that seemed to momentarily erase the years etched into his features. "Glad you like it, champ," he said. Mary chuckled nervously, feeling the weight of her earlier embarrassment linger. She fiddled with her coffee cup, stirring it even though she hadn't added anything. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "I know," Mike replied, his tone even. He leaned back slightly, wrapping his large hands around his cup. "But I wanted to." There was something disarming about his presence. Despite his disheveled appearance and the unmistakable signs of a hard life, his demeanor radiated a quiet confidence, a remnant of the fighter he once was. "I'm sorry," Mary said, unable to contain her curiosity any longer. "I didn't mean to stare earlier. It's just, you're Mike Tyson. I mean, everyone knows who you are." He laughed, a low, throaty sound. "I get that a lot," he admitted. "Most folks recognize the name before they recognize the man." Mary nodded, unsure of how to respond. Ella, however, was less reserved. "Mommy says you're famous. Were you in the movies?" she asked, her wide eyes sparkling with curiosity. Mike shook his head, chuckling. "Not exactly, little one. I used to be a boxer, a fighter." He paused, glancing at Mary. "Back in the day." "Wow," Ella exclaimed, her eyes growing even wider. "Like Rocky?" Mike laughed again, the sound lighter this time. "Something like that." Mary couldn't help but smile at the exchange. Ella's innocent enthusiasm seemed to momentarily bridge the gap between their lives, allowing her to relax just a little. "So," Mike said, turning his attention back to Mary, "what about you? What's your story?" Mary hesitated, caught off guard by the question. She took a small sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "There's not much to tell," she began. "I'm a single mom, trying to make ends meet. Lost my job a few weeks ago, and things have been tough." Mike's expression softened. "I hear that," he said quietly. She hesitated again but found herself continuing. There was something about the way he listened, intently without judgment, that made her feel safe. "Ella's dad left before she was born. Since then, it's just been the two of us. I've been working whatever jobs I can find, but it's been hard. Rent's due next week, and I'm not sure how I'm going to pay it." Her voice cracked slightly, and she quickly looked down, embarrassed by her own vulnerability. "Sorry," she murmured. Mike shook his head. "Don't apologize," he said firmly. "Life's not always fair, but you're still here, still fighting. That says a lot." His words caught her off guard. They weren't overly sentimental or patronizing, just simple and honest. "What about you?" she asked, shifting the focus away from herself. "If you don't mind me asking, how did you end up here?" Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. He stared into his coffee for a moment, as if searching for the right words. "It's a long story," he said finally. "Had it all once. Money, fame, people around me all the time. But when you lose it, you find out real quick who's actually in your corner." He glanced up, meeting her gaze. "Turns out, not many were." Mary frowned, her heart aching at the quiet pain in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said. "Don't be," he replied. "I've made my share of mistakes, trusted the wrong people, made bad choices. But life's funny that way. It knocks you down, then teaches you how to stand back up." Ella, oblivious to the weight of the conversation, tugged at Mary's sleeve. "Mommy, can we come here again tomorrow?" "I like Mr. Mike," she said, her smile radiant. Mike's face softened, and he reached out to gently tap Ella's nose with his finger. "I like you too, champ," he said, his voice warm. Mary felt a lump rise in her throat. In this moment, amidst the clatter of the coffee shop and the quiet struggles they both carried, she realized something profound. Sometimes strength comes not from what you have, but from what you're willing to give, even when you have almost nothing. "Thank you," she said again, her voice steadier this time. Mike nodded. "Anytime." The warmth of the coffee shop contrasted sharply with the cold world outside. Mary found herself leaning in as Mike Tyson spoke, his voice steady but tinged with a weariness that hinted at untold stories. Ella had finished her hot chocolate and was now busy drawing invisible pictures on the foggy window beside their table, leaving the two adults to talk. So, you had everything. Money, fame, success, Mary began hesitantly. What? What happened? Mike sighed, his broad shoulders sinking slightly under the weight of the question. He cradled his coffee cup in both hands, staring into the dark liquid as though it might hold the answers. It's hard to explain, he said finally. When you grow up with nothing and then suddenly you've got everything, it's like, he paused, searching for the right words. It's like a hurricane. It sweeps you up, spins you around, and when it's done, you don't even recognize yourself anymore. Mary nodded, sensing that there was more. I came from nothing, Mike continued, his voice deepening with the rhythm of his memories. Brownsville, Brooklyn. Roughest place you could imagine. My mom did her best, but she couldn't protect me from the streets. Got into trouble early. Fights, stealing. By the time I was 13, I'd been arrested more times than I could count. Mary's eyes widened, but she stayed silent, letting him tell his story. Boxing saved me, he said, his tone softening. Custamato, my trainer, my mentor, he took me in, taught me discipline, gave me purpose. When I stepped into the ring, I wasn't a scared kid anymore. I was unstoppable. Mary could see the glimmer of pride in his eyes as he spoke, but it quickly faded. Then the money came, he said, his voice turning bitter. Millions, mansions, women. Everywhere I went, people told me I was the greatest, and I believed them. I thought I was untouchable. But that kind of life, it's like quicksand. The more you try to hold on to it, the faster it slips away. Mary felt a pang of sadness as she listened. She had seen enough in her own life to understand how quickly the world could turn on you, how easily people could disappear when you needed them most. What about your friends? Your team? She asked. Mike chuckled darkly. Friends? When you're on top, everyone wants to be your friend. They'll laugh at your jokes, party with you, tell you whatever you want to hear. But when the money runs out, so do they. One by one, they're gone. All you're left with are the mistakes you made and the people you hurt. Mary shifted uncomfortably, the weight of his words pressing down on her. But surely there were people who cared about you, who tried to help. There were, Mike admitted, but I was too proud, too stubborn to listen. By the time I realized it, I'd burned too many bridges, lost everything, my career, my money, my family. And once the world sees you as a failure, it's hard to climb back up. His gaze drifted to the window where Ella was now tracing a lopsided heart with her finger. A small smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. Funny thing is, losing it all, it teaches you what really matters. Mary tilted her head, curious. And what's that? Not the money, not the fame. Definitely not the people who only loved me when I was winning, he said. It's the little things. A kind word, a hot meal, a moment like this, sitting at a table with someone who doesn't expect anything from you. Mary felt her chest tighten. For years, she had been running on empty, scraping together every ounce of energy just to survive. But in this moment, she realized how much those small acts of kindness had meant. The neighbor who had watched Ella when she couldn't afford daycare, the friend who had slipped her an extra 20 when rent was due. I guess I know what you mean, she said softly. It's the little things that keep you going. Mike nodded, his expression thoughtful. Yeah, and sometimes when you've lost everything, you find something even better. Perspective. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words sinking in. Ella turned from the window, her cheeks flushed with excitement. Mommy, look, she said, pointing at the heart she had drawn. Mary smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. It's beautiful, sweetheart. Mike leaned forward, tapping the table with his finger. You've got a good kid there, he said. She's a fighter, just like her mom. Mary's eyes welled up, but she quickly blinked back the tears. Thank you, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Mike sat back, a faint smile on his lips. Don't thank me. Just keep fighting. That's what life's all about. For the first time in weeks, Mary felt a glimmer of hope. And for the first time in what seemed like years, Mike felt something he hadn't in a long time. Purpose. The coffee shop's hum seemed to fade into the background as Mary and Mike continued their conversation. For Mary, every word felt like peeling back another layer of a man she'd only known through headlines and television. For Mike, each sentence carried the weight of years spent learning life's harshest lessons. Their talk was interrupted when a man in his mid-30s approached the table. He wore a neatly pressed suit, his leather briefcase dangling from one hand. His eyes flickered with a mix of awe and uncertainty as he looked at Mike. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice tentative. "I don't mean to interrupt, but are you Mike Tyson?" Mike's face remained neutral, his hand still wrapped around his coffee cup. "Yeah," he said simply. The man's demeanor shifted, becoming almost reverent. "Wow," he said, a nervous laugh escaping him. "I used to watch your fights when I was a kid. My dad and I never missed one. You were incredible." Mike nodded, his lips curling into a faint smile. "Thanks," he said. The man hesitated, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a $20 bill. He placed it on the table in front of Mike. "I know this might sound weird, but you gave me and my dad some of the best memories of my life. This is the least I can do." Before Mike could respond, the man gave a quick nod and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. Mary stared at the bill, her emotions a mix of surprise and sadness. She looked up to see Mike's reaction. His expression was calm, but there was a flicker of something deeper in his eyes, an old pain resurfacing. He slid the bill across the table toward Mary. "Here," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "Use this for your rent." Mary froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What? No, I can't." "You can," Mike interrupted, his voice firm but kind. "You need it more than I do." Tears pricked Mary's eyes as she looked at him, the words caught in her throat. "But this is yours. That man gave it to you." Mike shook his head, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "He gave it to me because of what I used to be, not who I am now. And right now, I'm just a guy who knows what it's like to need a little help. Take it." Mary hesitated, her hands hovering over the bill. She wanted to protest, to push it back toward him, but something in his expression stopped her. There was no pity in his eyes, only an unwavering sincerity. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Mike nodded, leaning back in his chair. "Don't mention it. Fighters help each other out. That's how we get through." Ella, who had been quietly drawing on a napkin with a pen she'd borrowed from the counter, looked up at that moment. "Are we going to be okay now, Mommy?" she asked innocently. Mary's heart broke at the question, but she managed to smile. "Yes, baby," she said, brushing a hand through Ella's curls. "We're going to be okay." Mike watched the exchange with a quiet intensity. For a moment, he was reminded of his own childhood, of the struggles, the uncertainty, and the brief moments of hope that had kept him going. As the minutes passed, the conversation turned lighter. Mike told Ella stories of his training days, describing how he used to run miles before dawn and punch bags so heavy they swung like pendulums. Ella listened, wide-eyed, occasionally giggling at his exaggerated gestures. Mary sat back, watching the two of them with a mix of gratitude and disbelief. In the span of a single morning, her life had shifted in a way she hadn't expected. When they finally stood to leave, Mary extended her hand to Mike. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, her voice steady now. "You just did," Mike replied, shaking her hand firmly. As they stepped out into the cold, Mary couldn't help but glance back at the coffee shop window. Inside, Mike was still at the table, staring out into the bustling street. For all his kindness, there was a sadness about him. A man who had given so much, but seemed to carry a weight he couldn't put down. Mary held Ella's hand tightly as they walked away, her heart filled with a newfound determination. Mike had given her more than money. He had given her hope, and she vowed to carry that with her, no matter what lay ahead. The icy wind bit at Mary's cheeks as she and Ella stepped into their modest apartment later that evening. The apartment was cramped, with peeling wallpaper and a persistent draft that crept in through the window frames, but it was home. Mary set Ella's coat on a hook and pulled her into a hug. "Go wash up, baby," she said, kissing the top of her daughter's head. Ella scampered off toward the bathroom, leaving Mary alone in the small living room. She pulled the $20 bill from her pocket and set it on the table. She stared at it, her mind swirling. It wasn't just the money, though every penny counted. It was what the gesture represented. She thought of Mike Tyson sitting across from her earlier that day, his presence both larger than life and deeply human. Despite his own struggles, he had seen hers and chosen to help. That act of kindness had shifted something within her, reigniting a determination she hadn't felt in years. After putting Ella to bed, Mary sat down with her laptop, the screen glowing faintly in the dim light of the room. She opened a job board website and began scrolling, her fingers hovering over the keys. Normally, the weight of rejection would have discouraged her, but tonight was different. Fighters help each other out. Mike's words echoed in her mind. For hours, she filled out applications, tailoring her resume and writing cover letters. The quiet of the apartment was broken only by the rhythmic clicking of the keyboard. Meanwhile, across town, Mike walked into a local shelter, his breath clouding the air as he stepped through the doors. The place was warm but crowded, the scent of soup wafting from the kitchen. People greeted him with nods and smiles, some recognizing him, others just glad for a familiar face. "Tyson!" a man called from a folding table near the back. It was Carl, a wiry man with a gap-toothed grin who ran the shelter. "You're late tonight. Thought you ditched us." Mike smiled faintly, shaking Carl's hand. "Got caught up," he said. "Met someone who reminded me why this place matters." Carl raised an eyebrow but didn't press for details. "Well, we could use your help. The line's long tonight." Mike nodded and got to work, ladling soup into bowls and handing them out to the steady stream of people. Each interaction reminded him of how far he'd fallen and how far he still had to climb. But there was something satisfying about the simplicity of it, about giving without expecting anything in return. As the night wore on, he found himself thinking about Mary and Ella. He hoped the $20 would make a difference, but more than that, he hoped his words had left an impression. The next morning, Mary stood in the kitchen, the scent of fresh coffee filling the air. Her phone buzzed on the counter, and she grabbed it quickly, her heart leaping at the sight of an unfamiliar number. "Hello," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Hi, is this Mary Jenkins?" A woman's voice replied. "This is Susan from Lambert & Co. We received your application for the administrative assistant position, and we'd like to invite you in for an interview." Mary's knees went weak, and she leaned against the counter for support. "Yes, absolutely, thank you." After ending the call, she covered her face with her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks. It wasn't a job yet, but it was a chance, a step in the right direction. Ella padded into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. "Why are you crying, Mommy?" Mary knelt down and pulled her into a tight hug. "Happy tears, baby. Just happy tears." That evening, as Mary tucked Ella into bed, she told her a new bedtime story. It wasn't about princesses or knights, but about a mighty boxer who had lost his crown, but never his heart. "And then," Mary said, her voice soft, "the boxer helped a struggling queen and her little princess, not with gold or treasure, but with kindness and courage, and that made him the greatest champion of all." Ella giggled sleepily, curling into her pillow. "I like that story, Mommy." Mary kissed her forehead. "Me too, baby." As she turned out the light, Mary glanced at the small drawing Ella had made earlier, a lopsided heart with 3 figures holding hands. She smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. Mike Tyson's kindness had sparked a fire in her, a reminder that even in the hardest moments, there was strength to be found, and she would carry that strength forward, one small step at a time. Weeks had passed since that morning at the coffee shop. Mary's life had begun to shift in subtle but significant ways. She had landed the administrative assistant position at Lambert & Co., a steady job with regular hours and a livable wage. For the first time in what felt like forever, she could breathe a little easier. Ella had noticed the change, too. Her mother's laughter came more often now, and the worry lines that had crept onto her face were beginning to fade. Together, they had started saving for small luxuries, a new winter coat for Ella, a set of fresh towels for the apartment. But Mary hadn't forgotten Mike Tyson. None. One afternoon, as she sat scrolling through her phone during her lunch break, a headline caught her eye. Once a champion, always a champion, Mike Tyson gives back to the community. Her heart skipped a beat. She tapped on the article and began to read. The piece detailed how Mike had started volunteering at a local shelter, organizing food drives, and even using his name to bring attention to the plight of the homeless. The reporter described him as a man who had been humbled by life, but was determined to rise again. Not in the ring, but as a champion of compassion. Mary stared at the screen, a lump forming in her throat. She had to find a way to thank him. The following Saturday, Mary and Ella made their way to the shelter mentioned in the article. The building was modest, its exterior worn, but welcoming. A line of people stretched down the block, waiting for a hot meal. Inside, the hum of activity was immediate. Volunteers bustled about, handing out trays and pouring cups of coffee. At the center of it all was Mike Tyson, wearing a simple sweatshirt and jeans. He was serving soup, his powerful hands steady as he filled each bowl with care. Mary hesitated for a moment, watching him from across the room. Then she took a deep breath and stepped forward, Ella's small hand clasped in hers. "Mr. Tyson," she said softly, her voice barely carrying over the noise. Mike looked up, his brow furrowing slightly before recognition lit his face. "Hey, Mary, right?" She nodded, a smile spreading across her face. "I read about what you're doing here. I wanted to come by and say thank you. For everything." Mike glanced at Ella, who was clutching a folded piece of paper. "And who's this?" he asked, crouching down to her level. Ella grinned and held out the paper. "I made you something." Mike unfolded the drawing carefully. It was a colorful depiction of a boxer in a cape, standing tall with his fists raised. Beneath it, in wobbly letters, Ella had written, "Thank you, Mr. Mike." For a moment, Mike was silent, his eyes scanning the drawing. When he finally looked up, his voice was thick with emotion. This is beautiful, champ. Thank you." Ella beamed, clearly proud of herself. Mary placed a hand on Mike's arm. "You changed our lives," she said earnestly. "That day at the coffee shop, I was at my lowest, but your kindness gave me hope. I'll never forget that." Mike straightened, his towering frame almost intimidating despite the softness in his expression. "I didn't do much," and he said, "You're the one who turned things around." "But you reminded me that I could," Mary countered. Mike smiled, the lines in his face deepening. "Sometimes that's all a person needs, a reminder." They stayed for hours, helping to serve meals and chatting with other volunteers. Ella became a hit among the shelter guests, her infectious laughter lighting up the room. As the afternoon waned, Mike walked them to the door. "You know," he said, his voice thoughtful, "you and your daughter, you're fighters. I could tell that the moment I saw you." Mary laughed softly. "We're learning from the best." Mike chuckled, shaking his head. "Nah, I just pass along what I've learned. The real fight, that's all you." They said their goodbyes, and as Mary and Ella walked away, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. That night, back at their apartment, Mary tucked Ella into bed. She turned out the light and stood in the doorway, watching her daughter drift off to sleep. On the kitchen table, Ella's drawing sat propped up against a vase of fresh flowers, a reminder of the kindness of a man who had once been a champion in the ring and was now a champion of the heart. For Mary, life was still a challenge, but she faced it with a renewed sense of purpose. She was no longer just surviving. She was fighting, just as Mike had said. And she knew deep in her soul that fighters never fight alone. Months passed and the bitter cold of winter gave way to the gentle warmth of spring. The city buzzed with new energy, and for Mary, life had taken on a rhythm she hadn't known in years. She was settling into her job at Lambert & Co., where her meticulous work and sunny attitude had already earned her a raise. For the first time in a long while, she felt stable. Ella was thriving too, her days filled with school, playdates, and bedtime stories. But one thing remained constant, her fascination with Mike Tyson. Almost daily, she would ask her mother, "When can we see Mr. Mike again?" The opportunity came one bright Saturday morning. Mary received a call from the shelter where she had left her contact information during their visit. "Mary, this is Carl," the voice said. "We're hosting an event next week, a charity boxing exhibition to raise money for the shelter. Mike thought you and Ella might like to come." Mary's heart leaped at the invitation. "We'd love to," she said, excitement bubbling in her voice. The day of the event arrived, and the shelter's gymnasium was alive with activity. The makeshift boxing ring was surrounded by folding chairs, with banners overhead that read, "Fighting for a Future." Mary and Ella arrived early, the little girl bouncing with excitement. Mike spotted them immediately, his face breaking into a grin. He crossed the gym in a few strides, crouching to scoop Ella into a gentle hug. "Hey, champ," he said warmly. "You ready to see some real fighters today?" Ella giggled. "Are you going to fight, Mr. Mike?" Mike chuckled and shook his head. "Not today, kiddo. I'm just the coach now, but I'll be cheering just as loud as you." Mary watched the exchange with a full heart. Mike seemed lighter, more at peace, as if he'd found a new purpose in his work at the shelter. The exhibition began, with young fighters from the community stepping into the ring to showcase their skills. Each match was met with cheers and applause, the atmosphere buzzing with positivity and hope. During a break, Mike took the microphone, addressing the crowd. "I've had my share of fights," he began, his deep voice commanding the room's attention. "Some in the ring, some outside of it. And I've learned that life doesn't just test your strength, it tests your heart. I used to think winning was everything, but now I know the real victory is using what you've got to lift others up. That's what today is about. We're all fighters here, in one way or another, and fighters stick together." The crowd erupted into applause, Ella clapping the loudest. As the event wound down, Mary and Ella found Mike near the ring, chatting with some of the young boxers. He turned as they approached, a smile lighting his face. "Did you like the fights?" he asked Ella. "They were awesome," she said, her eyes shining. "But I still think you're the best, Mr. Mike." Mike laughed, ruffling her hair. "You're too kind, champ." Mary stepped forward, her voice soft but firm. "Mike, I don't know how to thank you. For that day at the coffee shop, for everything. You changed our lives." Mike looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, Mary, I think we both changed each other's lives that day. Sometimes a simple conversation can remind you of who you really are." Tears welled in Mary's eyes, but they were tears of gratitude and joy. As they said their goodbyes, Mike handed Ella a pair of miniature boxing gloves, signed with his name, and a note that read, "Keep fighting, champ." Ella beamed, holding them like the most precious treasure in the world. That night, as Mary tucked Ella into bed, she placed the tiny gloves on the dresser next to the lopsided heart drawing. She stood there for a moment, reflecting on how far they had come. Mike Tyson, a man once larger than life, had shown her the power of kindness, resilience, and connection. In her heart, Mary knew this was the start of something new, not just for her, but for Ella, for Mike, and for everyone who had been touched by his story. Fighters never fight alone, and now Mary was ready to face whatever came next, with hope as her guide and strength in her heart. Thank you so much for watching this story. Your support means everything to us. If you enjoyed it and want to see more inspiring stories like this, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. We'd love to hear from you. What time are you watching this video, and where are you tuning in from? Drop a comment below and let us know. It's always amazing to see how far our community reaches. And remember, every share, like, or comment helps us spread these powerful stories to more people. Thanks for being part of this journey, and we'll see you in the next one.